Welcome to the IoT podcast show. And today I am actually not your host. So I am delighted to say this is the second in our series of the IoT podcast guest host Takeover. And boy, this is going to be a really big one. And we're delighted to have two previous guests on the show. Firstly, we have Rami Avidan, who was one of our early guest features on the IoT podcast, ex-CEO of Deutsche Telekom. Rami, thank you for joining us.
Hey, my pleasure. Always a pleasure being here, Tom.
And also we have Hima Mukkamala, CEO of Pelion, who was a guest just a few weeks ago. Thank you very much for joining also, Hima.
Thanks for having me. I guess you got tired of both of us. You said you guys have the conversation.
Well, you guys spoke so much, and you had so much good content to say, right? We knew we had to do something extra and get me out of the frame. So without further ado, enjoy the session. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hey, thanks. Okay.
Thanks, Tom.
So welcome everybody to the IoT podcast guest host Takeover. And as Tom just mentioned, my name is Rami Avidan. I'm the former CEO of Wireless, where I also co-founded the business. I'm also the former CEO of Tele2 IoT, part of the Tele2 group. And most recently, I was also the CEO of Deutsche Telekom IoT. I'm super excited, Hima, to have you on this chat today. Please introduce yourself.
Me too, Rami. It's been, you and I have had offline conversations and our interests match a lot and we have had a long history. So my job, I'm the CEO of Pelion. It's been an interesting journey, in the current context with what started as an incubation with an arm and then created as a new business unit. I ran that business unit as a GM, and over the last 6 months, it's been carved off as a wholly owned subsidiary of Arm. Outside of that, I'm an ultra trail runner. I run 200-mile races, and I recently did Everesting, and that's a conversation for a different time.
Indeed. Well, actually, you have told me some stuff about it. Very impressive, right? I'm talking about you running now. I mean, that is really awesome. So look, one of the things I think our audience is keen to understand, Hima, and we'll start with you, and I can answer it afterwards. Obviously now you're the CEO of Pelion, and so why don't you share some history of how you got into IoT, and more importantly, why you got into this space, right?
Yeah, it is an interesting question. If I look back at 15 years back, I've always tried to stay ahead of the technology trends. And this was 2006 when people weren't aware of mobile and the concept of mobile first were not there. In my old company, Sybase, we were building a mobile platform to bring mobility as a first-class citizen. So we went through that, we got acquired by SAP. And then I was looking at what's the next trend in this space, in the technology space. And I could see that all these air-gapped assets coming, like the jet engines, gas turbines, were going to be connected so that much more valuable outcomes could be generated. And so that's why I joined GE Digital to build that first digital IoT platform. That was my first interaction with IoT, dealing with these connector, sensors in these big assets. And it was interesting to go from small phones to these big assets, on a big scale. So that was how I got into IoT. I'm sure this was there. I would be interested in your experiences because, we called it IoT, but these assets and connected sensors were there for the last 50, 60, 70 years, right?
No, exactly right. I mean, we put a sexy name on it now, right?
Yeah.
That more comes from, maybe startups and other players in the industry that wanting to sort of hot it up a little bit, right? But, I was in this game from, the very early 2000, right? So I've been now in it for more than 20 years, believe it or not, right? And obviously it's changed a lot over the years. I mean, the reason why I got in it was, I was an entrepreneur. And honestly, we had a small business in the telco space. We got in contact with some of the operators who had just launched some of the earlier data networks in the 2G infrastructure. And basically they asked us to help them fill it with data from machines. And that's basically how I stumbled into it. But of course, the interesting thing is some things happen in life by coincidence, but actually for me, that turned out to be a very lucky strike, because I love this industry. I love it because the impact that I've seen that it can have on businesses that have deployed it. I love it because it's not only sort of driving financial value for customers, it can also have a great societal positive impact, right? Reducing emissions, improving on the way that we use our resources, making sure that we send resources like food to places in the world where they don't necessarily have enough. So I think there are so many positives with this technology that I've seen happen, which also then of course makes it a privilege to be part of this industry, right? Which leads me to my second question, actually, Hima, because look, as you and I know, there are a lot of values being able to being extracted once you have deployed IoT technologies, right? But of course, we also know that it's not an easy thing to do, right? There are many, many barriers for enterprises when they look to digitize their businesses. So what would you say, number one, are the biggest barriers for these enterprises? And what would you say are the simple, or maybe not simple, but the clear points that you would like them to focus on to solve some of those barriers?
Absolutely. And like you've said, whatever you might call it, right? Digital transformation, just pure IoT or data challenges. It's become a kitchen sink. But what I've realized, excuse me, over the last, like you said, 10 years or so, you got to take a more holistic approach to it, because it's not a pure technology problem. It's not a pure people problem. It's not a culture problem. It's not a process problem. It's actually a combination of all of these. Right? You can't just wake up and say, I'm going to digitize everything. You got to think about how do you change the culture to become more agile, because you're solving problems more iteratively, right? That's how software works. That's how algorithms work. That's how AI works. You got to think about who do you have as people who are building these solutions, and do they have the right learning and the technology knowledge to build that? You got to think about the processes in place to make sure that you are able to do this transformation. And then finally, you and I touched on this previously, it has become such a technology-centric conversation. I've seen this, like a customer of ours, Johnson Controls, we just recently talked about it. They talk about how do smart buildings, and so we are enabling their smart buildings initiative. And so they talk about what does it do for their customers, right? Like you've said, better air quality, better facility management. And so thinking about what do these outcomes mean is the biggest barrier to what I'm seeing as adopting or transforming their businesses, versus purely talking about what technologies to use and so on. You can't just do IoT, right? You got to think about how do you connect your physical assets to the digital world, collect the data. So it's that holistic view of the business optimization, but people, processes, culture. I was surprised how big culture was part of digital transformation.
Look, first of all, Hima, there is nothing that you've said that I don't 101% agree with. I think you're absolutely right. And I think what my 20 years have shown me is that the customers, the users that have been the most successful, have been able to do three things. The first and foremost important thing is to ensure that the owners of the business, may that be a public business or may that be a privately, understand that a digital transformation is a fundamental shift of that business. It's going to change the way that revenue flows. It's going to change the way that we structure our organization. It's going to change the way that we capitalize our balance sheet. It's going to change the way that we develop and deliver our solutions. It's going to change who we interact with in the market. So that's the number one thing I've seen, right? You need the backing of your current owners on that transformation, because it's going to be painful, right?
Yeah.
You're typically going to go from very large streams to incremental, smaller revenue stream but that are recurring, right? And of course, from a valuation perspective, that's much more interesting from a long-term perspective, but you have to go through the valley of death. So that's number one. Number two, to be able to engage in these digital transformations, the companies that are successful have gotten every single leader in that organization on board, fully subscribed to this change, because it's a fundamental change of the business. And as soon as you've got, especially in these larger organizations, if you take Johnson Controls that you just mentioned, right? I mean, these are not small businesses, right? You've got layers upon layers upon layers of management. And of course, unless you can get those various layers to actually buy in fully to this blocks throughout your entire organization. So getting management fully fired up behind this to drive the change is super important. And the third thing is, look, the companies that look upon the transformation as a cost rather than an investment to become a more sustainable, growth-orientated, stable business long-term, they're going to fail. Why? Because when you look at it as a cost, you're going to immediately measure ROI. You're going to immediately measure what is the value that this is generating. Now, the transformation takes time. The one thing I can guarantee, the businesses that I've seen that have struggled to overcome this dimension, they've all failed, and many of them are out of business, or actually going out of business, because it is you as a corporate leader investing into your business to stay competitive, basically, right? And so that change has to be looked upon as an investment rather than as a cost. So I think we're very much aligned about that. But let's talk positive now, Hima, right? Because you and I are almost IoT natives, right? And we love this industry. And I think for some of our listeners, I think it would be great for you to share some of the opportunities that you see are created when we finally have taken out one of the large barriers, which is the complexity, right? Because it is a complex industry that we play in. But why don't we focus in first on the opportunities and the values that you see are generated?
Absolutely. And to your point, the adoption has to start always from the top and being tied to this challenge of how do you optimize your customers' business problems and so on. I mean, there are a lot of challenges, but like you have said, once you've solved the challenge of heterogeneity, security, and all the standard constraints that are preventing people, there's an incredible data pipe, right, that's going from these 60-year-old, 40-year-old assets without any modification, because the life cycle of these assets is pretty long, especially the industrial assets. So you have this really strong data pipe that's going from the physical assets to the cloud or wherever it's running, so that you're able to do, and just continuing with the smart buildings as an example, what I found out is that just a couple of values that they're able to add, especially in the COVID scenario, space optimization. Making sure that employees and people are separated with the right distance, they're able to do that better because they have sensors instrumented in the whole building, and they're now able to identify where people are sitting and making sure they're following the guidance, right? That's just one very real-time outcome that they've been able to drive through the investment they're making in their digital transformation. Second, you've touched on this, energy reduction. As we look at this day and the future, we got to reduce our energy usage. And so they're able to identify which parts of the buildings are being used, which are being less used, and in real time, being able to control the usage and the heating and the cooling of the building. And also commercially, they're able to give more services to the customers to increase the revenue opportunities, right? They're able to offer to their building operators services so that they can enhance the services for end customers who are renting, leasing their building spaces. So there's just one area, one vertical where we are seeing these opportunities come across. And something that you said resonated really well with me. It's about the health of the people in the building. It's about the quality of life of the people in the building. And this is relevant, applicable in even the other verticals that we are seeing, right? We work with smart metering companies. it's the same story. The fact that you have a better connected meter, now you're able to, as a provider of electricity, gas, and so on, give a better financial outcome a consumer like me, sitting at a home trying to wonder why my heating bill has gone up by 200%. They're able to get that data better and better
Yeah.
now. And so, yeah, we're hitting 95 degrees soon, and the air conditioner is already on big time.
No, exactly. I mean, look, I think, I mean, that's all very true, Hima, right? I think, there are, of course, endless opportunities. I think if I wanted to highlight one opportunity, right, it's for the businesses that engage in these transformation. I mean, the opportunities for you to be able to outcompete your competitors in the market, right? Because at the end of the day, if I just take the use case that you mentioned, Hima, right? Being able to externalize more capabilities and services to your customers, obviously the output of that is that you gain more revenue share, right?
Yeah,
But the other
absolutely.
output, of course, is the company that can do that better, smarter, nicer, faster, right? Will be able to outcompete their competitors and take a larger market share and cement themselves in the industry that they find themselves in, right? So I think that's obviously the overarching opportunity combined with cost reduction and all of these other things. But I think our audience are well aware of that. But staying on opportunities, right? There are obviously the flip side to that, which is complexity, right? And threats. And so let's what is that complexity in your mind, Hima?
Uh, there are a couple of main complexities that we see as we have been working with the customers. And it happens in every technology trend, right? We've been long enough in this space, every trend comes with the complexity of the heterogeneity, which gets normalized through standardization, which gets normalized through standard software tools and so on, right? So that is one big complexity which we see. The sensor world is huge. And you add gateways, you add protocols, you add connectivity. So the permutations of connectivity, devices, network, cloud is huge, right? And so, how do you take a combination of these and then add to that the complexity of the old assets, right? Because you're not going to rip and replace the old assets, especially the industrial ones sitting out there. So that is a big, big challenge that I've seen, and we have come a long way in solving that. The second one that I see as a challenge is, and maybe we should talk more about it, security. If you talk to any CEO, the biggest thing on their mind is, by doing this, how am I making more risky the regular business? Because they would rather leave the assets disconnected than connect them and bring more risk on themselves, right? It's a question of value versus outcomes and the
Absolutely.
risk. And the last one is, customers have made their choices, right, on enterprise platforms. So how do you take your solution and make it run on customers' choices of cloud or networks or whatnot? And so it's not only your solution complexity, but it's the customer's environment complexity. And then you merge these two, it just, problem becomes, to the power of n. And so these are the sort of the main challenges I see, like in addition to, like you've said, right, how do you make sure it's the right outcomes and so on. But we're taking the right steps. I'm really optimistic. As we talked before, what I've seen in the last year and a half in terms of real transformative initiatives versus technology initiatives is giving me a lot of confidence in IoT. Yeah, we have presented all of the, nice, optimistic pictures of the last 5 years, but the real utilization is what we're seeing now.
Yeah. No, I fundamentally agree with that, right? So we basically have standardization, we have interoperability as big cornerstones. But there is one other area that I think is interesting, right? To also talk about that is a complex world for many of these enterprises. One of the interesting parts is obviously the local regulations in various markets, because so far today, not even in a homogeneous market such as Europe, we are having the same regulations in these various smaller states, if you may. And if you magnify that throughout the globe, of course, it becomes a rather complex regulatory landscape for these global players to navigate, right? Because these assets have to behave differently from a data delivery perspective, actually what they're allowed to do, not allowed to do in the markets, how they're allowed to access them. So there is a whole complexity, which is more of on the political side of things, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it's also a concept that we need to talk about. But I want to bounce back to one of the topics that you mentioned, security. Because of course, I would argue that I'm one of the culprits that actually didn't take charge of security in the early days, right? Security, having been a founder of an IT, not IoT, an IT security business back in the days that did encryption, shame on me, right? But it's an area that historically has been neglected, right? But honestly, how big do you today consider the sort of the lack of, or I shouldn't say the lack of, but how big is the security risk of today? Let's put it like that instead.
Just before we get into that, I mean, talking about regulation, talking about different laws, I feel like lawyers are the new software engineers. the number of time I've spent with lawyers, the legal aspects of it has been incredibly. It's good. It's what we need to do, because sometimes pure technical solutions are not going to solve it. But
Sure.
Joking aside. If you look at the recent, just last week, right, the Colonial Pipeline breach in US, right, that has caused major challenges for oil supplies to consumers. If you go back all the way, something like Stuxnet, right, which sort of created a lot of challenges. This is the biggest problem that I see, especially because infrastructure. This critical infrastructure deals with health. It could cause actually fatalities, and so these breaches of these critical infrastructure are a big worry for me, because if you think about this, the risk that as a CEO you're taking by connecting your assets and making them open and out of the air-gapped world is the biggest risk that I think, what I'm seeing in the market. But what I see is, I don't know, just 2 weeks back, UK government came back with a legislation. I was really encouraged to see that. They mandated 3 things. What they've talked about is no default passwords. You got to make updating the devices a key part of the solution, and implement a vulnerability disclosure policy. I mean, that is a huge step for me, because now it's forcing every solution provider to ensure that whatever you deploy for your customer employs these as part of your solution, right? And so there is optionally they have 10 other things like making security a first class element and so on. But fundamentally, this is a big part of what I think as what providers like us, deployers like our customers need to keep in mind. Capabilities come and go and it will change, but security has to be the fundamental aspect.
Yeah, no, actually, Hima, I fundamentally agree with you, right? I think we have to take the security threats seriously, and we have to make the relevant adaptations to our industry when it comes to technology, but also the way that we think about and act around security. And I think the only way we can do that is if we all come together and work together as an industry to work towards interoperable solutions, less proprietary technologies that are where it makes it easier for us to actually interlink them together. I think that's a very great and good start, right? And then, of course, as you mentioned, right, we need these guidelines from the government to help us push that through. But we can, of course, do a lot. So I fundamentally agree with that. But okay.
Just one thing I want to add, if I interrupt, right? We went from standard desktop applications to mobile first applications. I'm hoping we can come to a world of security first, right? That's my hope, and that's what I believe is going to make everyone think about. It's always, we've built these solutions where at the end someone comes in and says, let's do a security check of the solution, right? But if you think of security first as the paradigm, I am confident that we can solve the problem.
Yeah. No, I think that's a very good way of looking at it. So I hope our listeners will take that with them and help us drive that notion. I will for sure be holding that flag up for you, Hima. So look, listen, let's switch track a little bit, right? Because both of us pretty, I shouldn't say that we're experts, but we pretty much know a lot about the mobile network operators around the world and the IoT industry that they look at, right? But I mean, we obviously know where they come from and what they've done and their position, but what do you think are their future potential role or roles for both the small but also the larger telcos of this world, right? Well, where do you feel that they should be positioning themselves, or where do you think they will position themselves?
Yeah. Um, it's funny. The world's changing so fast. For us to consider experts in any field, it's like, my daughter probably knows a lot more about some of the things than I do. One of the biggest trends I see, and it's probably good to, it's good to have your thoughts on this, is I was able to update my phone, consumer phone, to a different network with multiple profiles very seamlessly without taking out a SIM card and adding a new profile. This whole notion of UICC, and the biggest trend I see in the device space is the iSIM, right? The putting connectivity into the silicon, into the SoC, and that way you bring the BOM size down. And so it puts the MVNOs and the MNOs in a very interesting position, looking beyond purely connectivity, because now everything, the application processor, the connectivity processor, the AI processor is all on the same SoC, right? That's where the converged trend is happening on the device. So I look at the MVNOs and the telcos providing a lot more than connectivity, managing the life cycle of the whole SoC, right? The applications, the AI, the algorithms that run on it. And so I've seen analysts sort of expand the scope of what is an MVNO to include these services beyond pure connectivity. That's the trend I see, where there is a convergence happening across connectivity, across lifecycle management. The second big trend I see is, as more of these devices are getting connected, the MVNOs and the MNOs have a big role to play in data analytics, and especially security analytics, and then optimization analytics, because they're seeing a lot of data volume go through, playing that role, being able to be the first interceptor of data, obviously with their customers' permissions, and being able to apply them, and as this and it becomes a faster way to outcomes, right? Because you're not pushing all the data into the cloud. You are being able to interpret the data in the edges of the network, and then being able to send the guidances to the assets much quicker. So if I would say these are the two big trends I'm seeing: convergence and a bigger role in the analytical space, especially because of edge computing.
So I don't disagree with that, Hima. Having now been sort of running two large IoT units within telcos, right? I don't disagree with that. But there is a complexity for the operator, right? And the complexity is the following. The IoT business is typically a fraction of their overarching business that they run as a telco. Their sales channels are typically not geared towards complex solution sales, which is very much where IoT resides, right? Very much more of a consultative sales approach, right? Very similar to the way system integrators would sort of approach it, right? So I think they have an inherent complexity in them, which is why, for example, I believe that the more agile, focused MVNOs with the right type of ownership structure, access to capital, will probably be the sort of service providers that will, in the long run, prevail.
Yeah.
Okay? But only the ones that are sort of really gaining market share, right? I believe that the smaller MVNOs will either go out of business or they will be consumed by the larger MVNOs that are out there, right? So that's the first one. The second one that I think is interesting to discuss is, you know, we have these hyperscalers, right? And not that I like that terminology myself, but you know, it's a coined concept by now, right? So, you know, I think it's only a matter of time before they basically make connectivity available as part of their solutions, and they've already started. I mean, if you look at AWS, right, they have integrated a wide variety of underlying, typically MVNOs. And I know Microsoft is also doing that in their marketplace. So at one point in time, what I'm fearing for the operators is, of course, that they will be marginalized, right? That they will become the dumb bit pipe that they absolutely don't want to become, right? And I think the only reason, or the only way they will be able to navigate away from such a fate, would be for them to actually think differently about their IT business, and that they structure themselves differently. But I am actually personally very worried about the telco space here. I think the likes of your business, Pelion, the likes of the hyperscalers, and a whole host of other MVNOs, and especially also some system integrators that I see are doing some very interesting things. Unless the telco community really gets its acts together, I think they're in for a ride. Let's put it like that. That's basically my 2 cents on the situation, right? I hope it's not too gloomy for you or for any other listener, but that's the way I'm looking at it.
Yeah, I mean, every opportunity, every threat comes with an opportunity, right? And so we went through the same sort of fear and challenges when mobile applications and mobility was becoming first class. And if I would say they missed the opportunity in that space, right? But now I think I feel like, especially looking at some of our partners, they're starting to get that better view of how do they participate in this new ecosystem, and
Yeah.
so that's encouraging to see. But you are absolutely right. You have to think differently to participate in this ecosystem.
Yeah, no, I think so. Look, let's not dwell on it. I can spend hours and hours talking about it, right? But let's move on, right? So now finally, Hima, obviously this is an industry that we apparently both of us really love and really care for, right? So where would you like to see that IoT will take us in the future? What is, if you can sort of paint your own vision of where it will take us? What is that?
You know, I'm a simple man, and I would like to take back to what you said in the beginning. If we can make a world where our basic needs, right, health, food, water, just as an examples, environment, if IoT can make all of this better, along with make better business outcomes for enterprises, right, either for their end customers, I think that's what I want IoT to become. I want it to become invisible, right? I want it to become invisible so that no one talks about it, and just are dealing with the data that comes out of these connected things. I want to just share an interesting use case. So when I started running, there was a time when I was running up a mountain, and I could not breathe, and I wasn't sure my O2 levels, right? I had asthma, and I couldn't find out what was it, right? Because then I was just sitting there. These days I have a watch with an O2, right? And I don't have to guess whether I'm going to not be able to breathe because of the altitude, because it gives me the data immediately. It's made my life as a runner better, right? And it's because it's instrumented with a sensor that can, check my O2 levels. And so just that is just one example, right? We've talked about JCI, about how our buildings are made better, the quality of air is better. And so that's what I'm looking forward to, right? A comfortable working life and make it invisible. I want to stop talking about IoT,
You know what?
if that makes sense.
Actually, I love that, and actually, I've been saying that for a long time. I haven't used the word invisible, but actually, I think that's the way we end this session.
Yeah.
Your dream, my dream, is for IoT to become invisible in the future, and for it to be integrated in everything, making everybody's lives better. May that be privately or from a business perspective. So let's put a cap on that. Look, it's been an absolute blast, Hima. You're fantastic to have on the show. And obviously, I'm fantastic to have on the show as well. We've had a real jolly good time. Thank you for letting us do this, Tom. This is really a good setup, and I wish you all the best with it. Hima, thank you so much for taking the time. Much appreciated.
Thanks, Rami. It was always a pleasure talking to you. Have a good day.
Thanks,
Bye.
thanks, everybody. Ciao.